cast your mind back to when we talked about property binding, the way that we bind to a component is the same way that we would bind to an element. So what we essentially need to do is pass the data down into this component. Now, if we hide this for now so we can then edit our donut list, if you cast your mind back to using these h1 tags, and we did something such as inner text, and then passed in a value such as donut.name, if we then hit save, and we have this property which has been bound to. So in the exact same way, if we wanted to pass down the entire donut object and perhaps pass it down as a string, we've then given the h1 tag that entire object. So in the same fashion, we want to do the exact same thing with a donut card. So we can say on this donut card, it's going to have a donut property, and that is then going to be the value of donut. So this donut here is what we're going to be passing down, and we're just going to create another property which we can then bind to with square brackets. So the nice thing about this is that Angular is going to then give us a warning, cannot bind to donut as it's not a known property, which means that we need to then declare it as a property that's going to be given to our donut card. So if we save this out, we can then jump into our donut card, bring back our template. So it means that we want to essentially get these template pieces working again. So instead of our onInit, we're going to use something called an input. We can then go down and remove our onInit. We're not going to use that lifecycle hook inside of our component. So we can remove this entirely. Now, because it doesn't have a property called donut, we then need to create one. So we can then say donut is going to exist, and that is going to be of type donut. So if we start typing, we can then hit enter, and then this is going to then import our model definition, which we then created beforehand. And you can see now that we have all these properties. Now that isn't quite the end of the road, because we need to use this input to tell Angular that this is an input binding. Data comes in to the component via an input, so we need to simply mark it as an input. To do this, we can use @ to use a decorator, and then simply declare it like so. So this TypeScript decorator is essentially sprinkling some Angular magic on top of this donut property to tell Angular that it is expecting some data to be bound from the parent. Wherever this is going to be used, this donut property needs to be called the same thing here. Now, just to show you as well, we could rename this to item, and we could do the same up here. So it doesn't matter what this variable is called, and it doesn't matter what this variable is called. It just so happens that they are both the same name in our case. Of course, if we rename this to item, our template then starts to give us some errors. So this would then need to be renamed to item as well. So we'll leave things as donut because I think it makes sense from a naming convention. We have the donut card, and then what's coming in is in fact the donut. So this is great because we now can use this component, and all the logic is then inside that particular component. So what we could do now is duplicate this 3 times. Now, instead of accessing our single donut, we could do something like this. We could do square bracket 1, donuts, and then square bracket 2. If we then save this out, we then have a reference based on our collection array to every single one. So you see how easy that is to then reuse that particular component as many times as we want inside of our template. Now, this is a hard-coded, not very ideal way of doing things. So in the next chapter, we're going to learn how to control the flow of our application and render these out dynamically based on a list, which means at this point, we don't need this donut property anymore. We can simply go ahead and remove it. So essentially, we are taking our data from our ng-on-init. We have our donut card, which is then duplicated 3 times, 1 for each piece of data that we have. However, this is hard coding it. This isn't the best way that we can achieve this. There is a far more elegant and Angular-based approach that we can take. So we have learned how to componentize our data. We've broken down into a donut card component. We've talked about this property binding and passing a piece of data in. The square bracket syntax allows us to bind. If we don't use the square brackets, remember we are binding a plain string. So you can actually pass plain strings down if you'd like and mark them as an input. But we moved across our logic into this reusable donut card component, which is then registered in our admin module. We'll also come on to fully styling this application and making it look fantastic. We then talked about how to use type definitions, this idea of an input to declare a property that's coming into the component so we know where we are getting our data from. And it's very helpful to then be able to scan our component logic and see what properties are coming in and out. We'll also start talking about the output decorator as we progress through the course, which is our way of passing data back out of the component. For example, if we were to press delete on a particular item, we then want to instruct our smart component to go and delete it. We don't want to delete it down in these dumb components. And just to reiterate again, they are in fact dumb components because this component doesn't care where it gets the data from. And that is a very key point. It's unaware. It simply is given an object and it renders it. That's all it's in charge of. Data comes in and data can then go out if we have that particular requirement. The smart component is in charge of data fetching and the delegation down into these further components. So as we continue, we'll end up with a container with lots of dumb components that just manage smaller pieces of our application. So I hope that makes sense, and I hope you're excited to continue this journey. I've tried to structure this as the best way as I can to give you all the information to really master component architecture and the thought process behind not just creating a component, but why we should create a particular component.